in the middle of my We Got This series, talking through getting through whatever it is you need to get through. And today's title is We Got This, and if not, oh well. So everybody say, oh well. Right? That's where I need you to be, is oh well. Like, oh well. Next week, I'm going to finish the series with We Got This, 'Tis But a Scratch. For all of my Monty Python fans out there, we're going to talk about how to get through like the real difficult. How do you take something really difficult to God and, help others through real like that. Today, we're talking about limitations. We're talking about boundaries. We're talking about learning that there's space where you begin and where you end. And when it comes to how you interact with others, like you have your space and they have their space, and learning those kind of boundaries and limitations. And if you're starting to get nervous already, then you really need this stuff, especially as we head into Thanksgiving, where we have to spend forced time around family and things like that. And so that's what today is about. It's learning to live in the context of limitations. Now, I have a great dad. My dad turned 75 2 weeks ago, and one of the neat things that I see is like as he walks with Jesus, and God continues to transform him. The older he gets, the more positivity and more power and impact he brings to my family, my boys. God continually worked through him. When I was growing up, my dad watched three things. On Saturday, he watched bowling and Superhost. Any of you remember Superhost? Like, give me that shoe. Anyway, he watched bowling and Superhost. Remember that? No? You're just laughing at give me that shoe? Anyway, they would say, look, it's a bird, it's a plane. No, it's Superhost. And his shoe fell off and he would want his shoe back. Anyway. So, and he also would watch, bowling. You distracted me, Sandy. Stop laughing at my stuff. Bowling and Superhost, and then any Clint Eastwood movie. Anytime a Clint Eastwood movie was on, my dad was in. Favorite, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Most quoted, Magnum Force. He would quote Magnum Force all the time. One particular quote, and it would happen anytime anybody would do something dumb and like do something that they shouldn't do, get up on a ladder and bad things would happen, or maybe what we might call a hold my beer and watch this moment. Like anytime that somebody would get caught doing something dumb and pay the price for it, Dad would quote Magnum Force, a man's got to know his limitations. Said it all the time. A man's got to know his limitations. And then even with me, when he would see that I was going to do something I wasn't allowed to do, or don't talk back to your mom. A man's got to know his limitations. That was just something that Dad would. And it turns out that Clint Eastwood, Dirty Harry, he gave us some pretty sage wisdom, because the older I get in life, the more I realize that when we fail to know our limitations and our boundaries, bad things happen. They happen to us. Think about my last, not my last, but that, Polaris Bowl trying to play football like 20-year-olds and ended up with a concussion. Bad things happen physically when we don't know our limitations, but then also in the context of family gatherings and family relationships, bad things happen to families when we fail to understand boundaries and limitations. So one of the last good things that Facebook can bring in our life is every now and then some useful Bible stuff goes viral. That's the last thing Facebook is good for. That's all that's left of Facebook. And recently, there was a viral post talking about misquoted Bible verses, or even made-up Bible verses, things that aren't really in the Bible, but people think are in the Bible. And this went around. So there's some awareness about this, but some of my favorites are love the sinner, hate the sin. And that's spoken by, angry Christians everywhere all the time. Not in the Bible at all. Love the sinner, hate the sin, not really there. There's also money is the root of all evil. What's the Bible really say? The love of money is and it could be translated, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. There's also this, just in terms of biblical ideas, angels aren't humans after they die. Like the Bible doesn't say that when we die we become angels. Angels are a separate, created race or species or whatever creature. It's not humans after they die, but that's commonly believed that the Bible presents that, and it doesn't. But for me, the most dangerous in terms of misquoted, made-up Bible stuff is God won't give you more than you can handle. Not in the Bible at all. In fact, the Bible says the opposite. I know your grandma meant well when she lived by that. Not in the Bible. So here's what, let me read this to you real quick. Elijah is suicidal, went out in the desert to die. And an angel comes to him and makes some food for him. And the angel of the Lord says to him, "Get up and eat something. This journey is too much for you." In other words, right now, life is more than you can handle. See, every now and then, God gives us things or allows things to be in our life that are beyond what we can handle. And I think a lot of it is to teach us that we have limits. And there are certain things that we need Him for and others for because we humans don't do real well with understanding that we have limits and boundaries. You have limits, and I have limits, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not. There is a place where we begin and a place where we end. In our resources and time and everything else, there's a place where it begins and a place where it ends. This is a huge theme in the Bible. There are limits to things we can and should influence. There are limits to what we should or can take ownership of. Here's some of the horrifying implications of the truth that we have limits and boundaries. There are things that you are going to want to do but can't, if you understand that you have limits. There are things that you are going to want to influence, but you cannot or should not try to influence certain things because you have limits. There are experiences, this is really hard for us in suburbia, there are experiences that you are going to want for your kids or your family. But you can't and you won't if you start embracing the limits of your schedule. There are things that you're going to want your coworkers or your grown parents or your friends or your neighbors to believe. You're going to want them to think like that. But you just can't own. Because you have limits. There's a limit to how far you go and where they begin and where you end in their sovereignty. And when you understand those boundaries, you're going to realize, man, I can't own how they think. And there are responses that you're going to want other people to make. Certain things you're going to want them to do, how you're going to want them to act, how you're going to want them to respond. And you can't own that because you have limits. See, some of us just get crushed because we need for things to be a certain way. We need for them to act like this and think like this. And the problem is we have space where we begin and where we end, and we can't move over into it. And a lot of problems happen. We don't realize that, and we try to go too far into other people's existence, and then the more you find peace with your limitations and learn to live with them. Live to the full within them, but define them. The more you find peace with those limitations, the more you'll enjoy peace in this world. The more you need to live beyond your limits and need for certain conditions to exist beyond the limits of what you should own, the more miserable you will be, the more miserable you will be, like for other people to be around you, and the more miserable you'll make other people. There is a lot. You're going to see a couple examples here, but there's a lot in the Bible about understanding our limits. And I just, so it's like this. Most of the time when I get up here for a sermon, I tell you all, like, I'm not very good at this stuff, and I'm learning with you. This is something I feel like I figured out. I'm not great, but I think this is probably a strength of mine, and it's largely because I see the impact, the failure of living with limits and boundaries and an understanding and embracing of our limits and boundaries. I see the devastating impact it has on families, on individuals. I see the problems it creates, and so I notice just kind of, I get a little passionate and a little catty when I talk about it. I noticed that in my rehearsal, like, as I'm like, oh, you said that, kind of. But it's just because, like, this causes real problems in families, and like grown families, grown parents, aging parents, siblings, parent to kid, coworker to coworker. Like, okay, enough of that. Let's talk about sort of how the Bible frames it up and what can go wrong and will go wrong how important understanding limits and boundaries is to life as we know it. I'm going to start in Genesis 1, the creation story. So in the creation story, the concept behind the creation story, I believe, is for us to understand God, understand His nature, understand humanity, understand some basics of how the universe works, okay? This is not meant to be a textbook for science. There's a lot baked into this creation story for us to understand on a spiritual, existential level. So I'm going to read it, and this is kind of a mashup of the creation. And it's not that, like, I say that because we rob the creation story of its power and potential when we just try to mine it for science and how did the universe form and stuff like that, okay? So this is a mashup of Genesis 1 for time's sake. Listen to this in the context of boundaries. God's boiling down to the essentials, what He wants us to know about how things should work. And God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let separate its waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were over the expanse. Verse 9, God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear. And it was so, and God called the dry land earth, or land. And the waters that were gathered together He called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants according to seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind, on the earth. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning the third day. Now, with the repetitive language, if you just look under the surface, it doesn't bullet point it for you. But what you see is to bring order out of chaos. What does God do? He gathers and He separates, which means He establishes boundaries and limits. And when He sets a new boundary and limit, He says it is good. And there's this repetitive language where God makes light and he makes dark and he separates it out, and there's light and there's dark. And then on the first day, so then the days create a separation of time. And then he gathers water, and water's given its properties to stay separate from land, which has its properties that are separate. And even plants trees can't just go bearing fruit all willy-nilly. They have to keep in their own kind, and there's separation there to how far they can go. Everything is given boundaries and limits. You go this far and you stop here, and that is good. And here's another thing that's given limits, and it's good. And here's another thing that's given limits, and it's good. And all of creation is built on this idea that everything has its boundaries and limits, and that's good, and that's how creation is built. And so as we read this creation story from page 1 of the Bible, we begin to understand there's incredible importance in understanding and living according to the ultimate pillar truth that we have beginning and end and boundaries and limits to bring order out of chaos. God establishes limits and boundaries. And one of the greatest enemies to doing well in life, one of the leading reasons we drown in the face of adversity, is because we don't establish borders and limits. We own things that aren't ours to own. And we drown in the midst of chaos that we create by not knowing our own limits and boundaries and borders, and we take other people down with us. One of the reasons that we fail to thrive in life when we face adversity is because we deny and defy our limits. Have you seen this in life? I know I have in my own life and in the lives of others. Can you imagine if the creation order suddenly, things just started to defy their limits? Dirt just started floating up and mixing with the air that we breathe, and water just kind of started going anywhere, and we'd probably last a few hours and then the human race would be dead. If the limits and boundaries of God's good creation, yet with our lives so often we fail to realize and establish the fact that we have limits and live within those limits. All right, let me move on to a different story here. There's a Jesus story that towers above all others when it comes to establishing limits and boundaries and the damage they can do, particularly, and this is interesting about this story as we approach Thanksgiving and the holiday season, where we're going to mix with in-laws and everything else, okay? This is a story about how family dynamics can be hampered, can be affected when family members fail to realize their limits and try to impose into and onto the lives of other family members. You'll see what I'm talking about. This is Luke 10. Little story, inexhaustible application. Inexhaustible. There's all kinds of... All right, so here we go. Now, as they went, this is Jesus and the disciples, as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village. And a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was, what's that word? Distracted. Martha was distracted. Keep that word in mind. She was distracted with much serving, and she went up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but only one thing is," what's that word? Necessary. Only one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. So this is a story about understanding what is necessary versus what is a distraction. and then how we interact with each other and are necessary and all that. But let me stop for a minute. Side note, this is a freebie. Doesn't cost you anything. Real practical. The New International Version, Jesus looks at Martha and he says, clears his throat first. He says, few things are needed, indeed only one. Few things are needed, indeed only one. And for me, this has become, and I mean this is legit, okay, a life mantra. I use this a lot. And if you're overwhelmed, if your kid comes home with a note from school from a teacher saying he's a behavior problem, it may or may not have happened a few times with one of my kids. If you're in a marital squabble, that may or may not happen in the Poindexter marriage. If you are concerned about finances or your job or in some kind of a relational tension with somebody, if you're in the waiting room of a hospital, those moments when you are overwhelmed in life, think about that mantra. Few things are needed, indeed only one. Find some space, close your eyes, and picture yourself sitting there in the presence of Jesus, who is available wherever you are in all situations. And when you breathe in, you say to yourself, few things are needed. And when you breathe out, indeed only one. And it's like you're breathing in and welcoming the presence of Jesus, and you're breathing out all of the distractions, because few things are needed, indeed only one. And no matter what you're going through, you're reminding your soul in the deepest places of your existence, you're in the presence of Jesus, and that's all that really matters. And watch your heart rate drop and your blood pressure drop and your cares fade away as you sit there in silence and breathe in. Few things are needed, indeed only one. And there may be times after, Thursday at the in-laws this week when you just need to, go for a drive. Don't close your eyes when you're going for a drive, but just, or if it's that bad, maybe. Few things are needed, indeed only one. And just get yourself centered again around. That's just a little mantra that I got from that scripture that works really well when I'm really feeling the tension in life. All right. So, it's a story about establishing boundaries and limits. It's about priorities. It's the key word from Jesus here is necessary. And here's something that I see it in families and friendships and just tendencies. And I want you to think about the idea here, the concept that Martha has decided that there is a need. In her mind, what's the need? The need is to provide Jesus with and his disciples with good hospitality. For her, that has become a need when in reality it's just a want. Like Martha wants to, but according to Jesus, that doesn't need to be done. That's not necessary. Mary has figured out the necessary, and the necessary was spending time with Jesus. So Martha, and this depending on your personality, I hope that, if you need this, I hope it leans on you a little bit, okay? Martha has decided this needs to be done, but it's really just Martha's want. Martha wants that done. In Martha's mind, it needs to be done, but really it's just a want. She then imposes her want on to her sister and says, you need to help me. Jesus, she's not, you need to help me get. And there's tremendous tension in the story because one person has decided something needs to be done, which is really just their own want. And they don't understand their boundaries of where they begin and where they end. And so they then go over into another person's space and they say, you carry this too. They take their want. Have you guys seen this in your families or in your friendships where somebody doesn't understand that you have your own, and you got to embrace your own And that can be one of the hardest things, like just real practical. You're gonna, if you understand that this concept, then you're not going to impose your wants onto other people, but you're also not going to let them impose their wants onto you. And this can be really hard. This is a part of this, like for me, I'm a peacemaker and I hate conflict. It's made this last 18 months very fun to lead a church when I don't like conflict and I like to keep the peace. But it's understanding that you, just because they want you to do it, just because it's important to them, that doesn't mean that it's on you. You have boundaries, and there's a space where you begin and end, and you're okay? If you're listening online, I just did a lot of stuff with my hands. If you're listening to the podcast, with this in mind, this is where the oh well comes in. Got this. We got this. And if not, oh well. Because whatever this is, it's not going to keep you from experiencing connection with Jesus. And that makes it okay if it doesn't go your way. Whatever this is doesn't impact your connection with Jesus. Like for instance, fill in the blank. Does blank keep you from being connected with Jesus? Does your financial situation keep you from connecting with Jesus? No. If it does, that's on you, because it shouldn't. Does your marital status keep you from connecting with Jesus, whether you're single or you found the one? No. If it does, that's on you. Does that conflict at work or that busy season at work keep you from connecting with Jesus? No. And if it does, that's on you. Does how your parents vote keep you? Does whether they watch Fox News or CNN too much keep you from being connected with Jesus? If it does, that's on you. Does how someone respond to the pandemic, whether they wear a mask or not, does that keep you from connecting with Jesus? If it does, that's on you. That all these things that stress us out, and I'm not saying nothing's important, and I'm not saying don't have a cause. I'm simply saying, listen, at the end of the day, nothing can keep you from the presence of Jesus unless you let it. And so, if it doesn't go your way, oh well, you still have access to the most important thing in this world. You still have access to eternity through the presence of Jesus. So don't get overwhelmed. It's easier said than done, isn't it? Don't get overwhelmed by whatever it is you're facing, because at the end of the day, you can always connect with Jesus, which Jesus says is the only thing that is necessary. Don't get too distracted by the here and now in anything, because you always have connection with Jesus if you want it. A few quick points of application. Number one, acknowledge that you have limits. Like maybe for you, you just need almost on a 12-step level. I'm Alex, and I don't grasp that I have limits very well. Like, think through the fact that you have boundaries and you have limits. It's a real thing. And evaluate how much of your life is spent trying to move past those limits, deny those limits. And a good way to do that is to ask yourself, like, how much is my happiness contingent on stuff that's totally outside of my control? Like how many circumstances do I need to go my way in order for me to have peace in life? Because that'll tell you real quick whether or not you understand that you have limits or not. And just kind of look around, and maybe you just need to say, you know what? I have to understand that I have limits and learn to live within those limits and set my expectations to what's reasonable, to an understanding that I have limits, and just kind of be aware of that. Are you aware of what a major theme in the Bible understanding limits are? Or is that something you've never really thought about, and just sort of evaluate that? Number 2, this is really hard for suburbia. You cannot schedule your life to the hilt. You can't schedule your life to the hilt. You will ruin things. You will ruin your kids. And this is really hard, because it means, like I said earlier, that if we're going to set limits on what we schedule, if we're going to create our own enough and say, here's our limits, it means we're going to have to say no to things. And that means that other people's kids and families are going to experience things that we're not going to get to experience. I harp on this a lot up here, because the older I get, the more I see the older my kids get, and then you can kind of look in hindsight on family life, the more I see this as probably the number one the number one problem in suburban family is this idea that we have to give our kids every experience and be involved in everything, and I see what it's doing. And here's the problem. If you set limits on your schedule and protect space just to be a family, just to have something other than the next thing to go to, there are families out here, and we love them, who don't love Jesus and don't care about God's plan for their life or their family. They don't even like each other. The spouses don't get along. They have no ability to embrace silence or space in their life, and they're going to schedule themselves full to the grave, or till the kids are out of the house, where they then go their separate ways, because they just can't deal with, and they're going to live like that. And you're going to feel the tension, because your kids aren't going to get they're not going to be able to do all the sports stuff and all the activities and all the whatever that those families that have no boundaries are, but you don't want to live like that. Because what you're doing is you're giving your kids the gift of realizing that Jesus matters. If you don't protect church or spiritual growth and you schedule everything, then your kids, as they get older, they're not going to have any value for that either. And you're going to have to let those families do that and understand that, yep, they're going to get some political advantages in school systems and everything else. But you are giving your kids and yourself the gift of an identity apart from things and apart from activities and apart from accomplishments. You're going to give your kids the gift of being a family and of having space and of understanding that Jesus and church are valuable, but you're only going to get that and be able to give that if you set boundaries and limits to your schedule. And if you're just on the go, I've said enough about that. Finally, just ask, is this necessary? Is this necessary? Is what I'm worrying about, is it necessary? What I'm going to do or not do, is it necessary? And most of the stuff really is not. Now, that doesn't mean that you can never do it, or it just means that understand that there can only be so much of the unnecessary in order to protect what is necessary. Because here's the thing, like when I look at the Mary and Martha story, Martha felt like a victim and a martyr, all the while doing things for others that Jesus didn't even want her to do in the first place. Isn't that like crazy in that story? Is she's feeling like a victim, like a martyr, and it's all because she's doing stuff that Jesus didn't want her to do in the first place. She didn't understand her limits. Here's the other thing, is Martha is like kind of bitter and angry and irritable in the presence of Jesus because she couldn't sort out what was essential and what wasn't. And I've seen that in life where we don't know our limits and we want to do more than what we can, or we want to be involved in more than what we can. And we become bitter and angry with our family and with Jesus and in the presence of all that's important because we've overextended ourselves and we haven't embraced, because limits and boundaries, that's a gift from God. That sorts out chaos, order from chaos. It's a gift. God gives you the gift of having limitations. All right, so here's what I want to do. Here's how we're going to close this out. We're going to do one last song.